return because I was disobedient. I said, if that's the case, thank you. If that's the case, then I'm going to make it even more difficult for you. So now all the negative things that had to happen would happen. The backbiting started. There were a lot of accusations here and there. There were people who were treating me like I didn't matter. And I just didn't understand what it meant. Sometimes you have to plunge deep. Otherwise, you'll never be ready. Now,
Berla Mundi say ebusuya se wote fa kwa na wote wade so ansa na obeko TV3 akwakoye adwuma wo ho no na mra wo GhOne no na ye treat ne se de sebi o matakra on existe yemfa no enye hwe nti ono ankasa no oba adwuma no oba late sanse na nani nye onye obi akra ne nkasa anti na adwuma ho no owo ho nso sebi na oni ho.
I had to fight. I had to cry. There were guests who would walk into the building and they'll find me crying. And they're thinking, what is wrong with you? So now all the negative things that had to happen would happen. The backbiting started. There were a lot of accusations here and there. There were people who were treating me like I didn't matter. And I just didn't understand what it meant.
I'm 75 travel and tour nebusia omoboye chidom emi edi dwumede ebro makacho se bibi biara efa adesua ho se obekwa akosua de e wo Canada no e am 75 travel and tour ene de wo konti wo fa number na oni mpanyimfo edi nkomo afei so se wo yenwumako bi na opese wo ba ema ebo adweton de ho dero ede maodia onso obetimi ayene sa pepepe na yedi dwumede no ho dwuma edi ama Berla Mundi currently wo ye dwuma e wo TV3 na yenyina yenem ne se na oye adwuma e wo GhOne ansa na obeko TV3 akoye adwuma wo ho na GhOne so edwumre bi asamre nyina no eye na naba anamoa ene ye manager na samra na Berla Mundi e wo honom no samre na so ena na naba anamoa ode ne basewa amihie samre na topa video e ko viral e wo social media no so aba na ekame ekokoye se na ba wo ye manager no e di dwumadi a eya akese ni nyina ahye ne base wansa enti se Berla Mundi krampo ebreso se wo kwa akoye show a na nani nyi show bi a na opese wo ye a na ye the late afternoon show no na mpanyimfo kra emma kwan so obekwa akoye esan se na rhythms na eno modie omose wonye esan se no mu hunu se ehwa eno ofata nenso abaye no so ohunu ho se opese wo konanim oye bibi more challenging enti na opese wo the late afternoon show no ebeka ho enso na mpanyimfo se hene ne ha baby awowa ena abewonti ono ankasa no na otimi sua ema guest omo ba ne show so eye rhythms eba beto ne bisa ne sa so no no Berla no krampo no edien ene ha na esan se yehunu wo screen so a yehu se nani age wo ye happy bibia ekoso ema ne nenso inwardly no na enwoma ha no o say omo treating ne bad onye obi ane ne monkomo na ninka ansa na wo take bold step e de akọ TV3 akoye adwuma o ka asa nsemi e wa bra na goals and growth summit ekoso ho na Berla edin nsemi etudwa yentie.
And I'm going to make this very brief. I mean, on my way I was trying to figure out what to talk about. I had thought about a few things, but I needed to sort of put it in context. And I was trying to understand, okay, so when we talk about goals and growth, which aspect of my life do I need to talk about? And today, I'm going to talk about a part of my life that was very difficult for me, but that was what led me to what I've become today. And usually, I know on social media, or when we get to speak in public, we always talk about the nice things that happen in our lives. But we're human like everybody else. And so at the end of the day, we even face more challenges than anybody, especially because there's a lot of spotlight on us. And so people assume that things should be easy, but that's when the challenges become difficult. So I'll talk about the last parts of my journey at GhOne into TV3. And I want to use that to just let you understand that sometimes if you sit at one place, you're sitting on your blessing. And it's difficult to make that decision to eventually move, but that move is what brings the growth. But before you make that move, you should have a goal. Do you get how I'm connecting it? Okay. So, latter part of my days at GhOne, things had become very tough. I felt like I had grown to a certain limit, and the platform could not offer me what I wanted anymore. But I was afraid to make that bold step to leave. And that was because my whole journey as a broadcast journalist had started with GhOne when it was for Charterhouse and eventually when EIB bought it. So from the inception up until that point in my life, I felt like I owed the company something, a favor, or my career. And so it was going to be very difficult for me to say finally that I'm done and I need to move. I was looking for a way to move because things had become very difficult. I just wasn't finding myself in that space anymore, be it relating with people, the work I was doing, because even before I started the show I was doing before I left, I was doing rhythms. And I always say that every time there needs to be a move, I just wake up, sit in my bed, and God tells me, my friend, it's time, write this down, and I do. And so I had just started the late afternoon show. Just 1 year into it, I had won an award. Then there's an opportunity for me to move, and I'm thinking, I fought so hard to have this show go on air. Because when I wanted it on air, my bosses said, I'm sorry, this is not going on air. We're not letting you leave your previous show because we're not sure we can find anybody to replace you. And so instead of creating a void, we'd rather you stay there and just plateau. I mean, they didn't say plateau, but they just said, we also couldn't find anybody who could do that job, so you might as well stay there. But I had interviewed everybody that mattered in the music industry, in the arts industry, and I was tired. Because a month later, the same person will come and I have to now think of what other question to ask. Because I was recycling them over and over. So I told myself I was done with this and I needed a show that would challenge me. And I was done talking about music only and what are you doing, what's your album about. I just wanted something a bit more challenging. My bosses said no. I had to fight. I had to cry. There were guests who would walk into the building and they'll find me crying. And they're thinking, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, my bosses don't want me to start my new show. And it was all very upset because they just didn't understand the backstory of it. Now, eventually, I had people who helped me and I started that show. A year into that show, I'm told, it's time to move again. And I'm telling God, but you just gave me this idea. So why do I have to move? And he says, well, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to move. Because I made you start this show for a reason. And that was supposed to prepare you for the next journey. I still didn't understand. So TV3 gets in touch with me. The first time, I want to move. I tell them, okay, I'll come. But at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm like, you people, you're jokers. I'm not moving. So I accept, I sign a contract and everything. It's time for me to move. And then I have to tell them the bitter truth. I'm sorry, but I cannot make it. And it pissed everybody off, I'm sure, at TV3. They were very disappointed because they were just about ready to, put out the PR and say, so Berla is joining us. And this is me being so afraid to move. And so I got stuck in that space. For another 6 months, I was there. Now, this move came in March. So if my calculation is right, the final move I made was in September. So maybe about 5-6 months. Now, while I was there, things took a turn because I was disobedient. I knew I had to go, but I wasn't going. So God said, if that's the case, thank you. If that's the case, then I'm going to make it even more difficult for you. So now all the negative things that had to happen would happen. The backbiting started. There were a lot of accusations here and there. There were people who were treating me like I didn't matter. And I just didn't understand what it meant. But it was just God making the space uncomfortable for me. So eventually, I just told my manager that, you know what? Let's see if there's still an opportunity at TV3. So we started having that conversation. They said, well, there is an opportunity still. We left that slot open for you. However, you need to assure us you're coming because we're not going to put together all the materials, getting ready to announce, and you won't come again. And I said, oh, I'm very sure I'm going. Because at that time, I had had it. I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't see myself growing at that point. I was more depressed so I'd come to my show. If my show started at 3 o'clock, I'd get to work at 2:45. That's how badly I didn't want to be in that space. So 2:45, I'm there, and my boss is looking at me like, why are you coming this late? I'm like, oh, sorry, boss, I was doing something. But really, I'd wake up in the morning, and there was really no drive for me to want to be in that space. So I come at 2:45, my show ends, it's an hour, so it ends at 5, and I'm out. And that was consistent for a while. So I knew it was time. Luckily for me, there was an opportunity, and I had to move. Now, before that, I needed to ask myself, what really is your goal? Because it's not enough to say, I'm not comfortable here, so I just want to move. Sometimes you don't have a plan. Sometimes God has a plan for you. But at the same time, you also need to have an idea that, okay, maybe in the next 5 years, this is what I want to achieve. And just commit it to God and tell him that do the rest. If really this is not even the brightest idea, you know what to do. Just figure it out and help me. I'm just using my human mind. But that's why he says that your thoughts are not his thoughts and your ways are not his ways. So we plan and we plot. And we all have this fantastic idea of how in the next 5 years, I want to drive the biggest car in Ghana. I want to have the biggest house. I want to be working at the UN. But God is looking at you and thinking, my friend, maybe the UN will come, but not immediately, not in the next 5 years. Maybe I have to prepare and take you through some difficulties. And then in 20 years' time, when I'm sure that you're grown enough, you're mature enough, then I'll put you in that space. TV3 was not on my radar at all. Because at that time, TV3 wasn't doing too well. So it really wasn't part of my plan.
Joyfa syrup eye mujedru amapa eboa etu anemia ase deku afe eboam so ema ma ye fichi krono eye from edema ye nyina emema ni ma nyina so e kototo Joyfa na ya nonom esanse eboa ye ema ye nya moja esanso esone ye moja ne so ema bibia eye krogen ema ye nya ahoden amapa e de koye nwuma so Berla amfana no ensi wo to aso etwemu se na okopie mu so e wo TV3 honom no na enya ahogo no so kra etrese ono de na entertainment na ena na wo mu nenso koye no na e wo se okọ politics side enti wa wo show be o free entertainment e ko politics na chese enye agudie kra na enya ahogo no so eno fa no nenso so nyame adom ene adesua ene modern munti sam radio Obusua ebo ne homoden abibia aye kamanwema fama no ewo TV3 no twemu a the first 3 months ne de na show no woye no enheda nkoyi nti nkrofo to ton nkrofo roasting no ewo social media no so nenso ni nyina nkemfo na ne wabeye Berla bibia ekoso kama ede ama no ewo TV3 sanse mi nso bebre ene ka ho yenti.
I just thought that okay, right after GhOne I'm out of this country, I'm going to CNN, I'm going to BBC and all those things, and everybody will come to you and say, Charlie, where you've gotten to the BBC. So, you know, people plant that in your head and you feel like, then that's it. Once people are saying it's BBC, I'm not looking left, I'm not looking right, I'm just going. And so any offer that comes, I will not take it. But now I sit back and I think about it and I ask myself, so if BBC had asked you to come and give world news, would you have even understand where to start from? I don't think so. Because again, I was now growing in the social, you know, affairs space, and I was trying to figure out what it meant to even understand the Constitution and all that. I really didn't know. So if I had gone there, I probably would have failed instantly. But funny enough, for someone who was doing entertainment and had just moved into a different space, to be called upon to say you're going to do the morning show, and you're not just going to do the morning show, you're actually going to start talking to the politicians, so you better start reading around. I was like, okay, I'm not sure this is mine. Maybe someone else, not me. And they said, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to do it. So I moved, and then in the space of 3 months or so, I went to work one morning, and I was admiring the work that my colleague was doing, because he was the guy that had been on the show for so long. It was me and another lady, Crystal, and we had just joined. And he would grill the politicians and ask them all these questions. And every time he's asking them, I'm writing. I'm like, okay, Johnny mentioned ABC. Write it down. When you go home, go and read about it. I didn't know what it was about, but I still would go and read, at least just so that when it's intro time, I look like I know what I'm about. So I'll go and do my chew and point, come in, and when it's intro, I'm like, yeah, and this politician said this and that, and everybody's like, oh my God, Berla is intelligent. Oh, it was because Johnny had mentioned it the day before, so I'll just go and write it down so that I know that, okay, when it comes to saying this is what he said, okay, let me just add 1 or 2 things to it, and then that's it. But gradually, I started developing an interest in it, and then eventually, I went to work one morning. This was about 3 months into the show, maybe 4. One morning I go to work. I'm used to seeing Johnny there, and they say Johnny is sick. I said, pardon? Johnny is sick. And I said, so? There's nobody to do the big issues, the political conversation. So, sweetheart, you're going to have to sit in that chair. I said, oh no, I won't do it. Because I hadn't read anything concerning the topics that were trending. But I had to go and sit in that chair. Come and see. I was confused. I didn't know where to start from. I didn't even know who to introduce first. It was a mess, and I'll tell you that for a fact. I don't know if anybody here ever remembers the first day I ever did any political show, but it was a complete mess. And the messages that came, oh my God, who put Berla here? Berla should stay in the entertainment space. It's not for her. All kinds of things. So consistently, I had to face that kind of criticism. But the first day I did it, my boss called me and said, you've been initiated, so get ready, because we're going to make this regular. I said, oh my God, no, I don't want to do this. Initially, I fancied the idea of sitting there and grilling the politicians, but I was like, no, this is too much work. I'm not sure I'm ready. And they said, if you keep saying this, you'll never be ready. Sometimes you have to plunge deep. Otherwise, you'll never be ready. Now, I did a course with Harvard sometime, And so usually they would bring very successful business entrepreneurs to come and speak to us. Now this person that came to speak to us, I think one of our last but one classes or so, he owns one of the biggest watch companies in the world. And he came to speak to us, and he said something that really touched me. Now he said that usually as a little fish, when you're thrown into the water, I mean, of course, a lot of people swim with the tide. And it's very typical of human beings. We go with the flow, right? So everybody is going in this direction. I might as well go because I don't know what is here. I'm not sure how easy or difficult it will be. So let me go with everybody. But he says that there was one particular fish. When it was thrown into the water, instead of going in the direction of everybody, it was going the opposite way. So it was swimming against the tide. Now you see how the water is. Usually when you go to the beach, you see how it rushes to you. Do you ever try to swim into it? A lot of people, I mean, those who surf, they probably go into it and then they put their surfboard on top and it brings them back. But there are people who would go deeper and deeper, and you're thinking, why are you going there? You know this place, you're going to die. The water is going to carry you away, but why are you going? But he says that the reason his business was successful was because when everybody was doing A, he was doing B. So everything pointed to the fact that the direction he was going, there was going to be failure, because he was the only one going that way. Everybody else was going this way, but he said, no, I want to make something different out of my career. And so I'm going to quit my job. He had a fantastic job. He was getting paid a lot of money. He says, no, I'm quitting to start from scratch. And when he did, there were lots of hurdles, but he still decided to swim against the tide. It knocked him down. It gave him a migraine. He fell sick. He lost money, but he was still swimming against the tide. And then eventually, when he was able to get to that point where he had mastered the skills that was required to swim back, he didn't even have to struggle to swim because the tide just brought him back. And it was a successful journey for him. So he advised all of us that in life, you cannot go the direction of everybody all the time, because everybody wants to be the same. How do you stand out? And I related it to my days at TV3 at the beginning, when I was the only girl. I mean, at that time, they needed a woman to take over the affairs of, politics, because they didn't really have anybody doing that. Now, I was the one that they were looking to. And I was thinking to myself, but I was doing entertainment. Why do you want to put me in this? Then I remembered that course, and I remember that, okay, so if the man says swim against the tide, that means that every morning you're going to have to sit in that chair, you're going to have to speak to these politicians, and you're going to ask them all those difficult questions. You cannot succeed if they don't knock you down. So sometimes I ask them a question, they're looking at me like, did you just ask me this question? Like, you don't know? Because we bring a lot of people on board, people who are very well versed in, the various topics. And sometimes I ask a question, and the way they look at me, I know that's okay. This question I asked, they're bomb. It didn't make sense. But it didn't stop me. I'd go back and realize that, okay, so I made a mistake here. Let me go back and read about it. And then maybe that way I can do better the next time. But I had a goal, and my goal was to become one of the leading women who interact with politicians in the country. But it had to take a lot of knocking down, because my edges were off. So when I ask a question and it doesn't work, the comments are coming, the politicians are looking at me like, madam, you have a lot of reading to do. I'll go back and I'll read. And I'll read and read and not sleep till the next morning, so I can come back and better understand what it is I needed to talk about. Now here I am 4 or 5 years later, and I don't regret this decision I made. I was pushed out, yes, and don't think it was by any human being. I was pushed out by God. So sometimes you might think that people are making you uncomfortable in the space you are in, but it's not the people. It's God working through those people. So don't waste your time hating the people. You might feel some anger towards them, but over time you need to let it go. Because if you don't heed to that call and move out of that space, you won't grow. You'll be stuck. You'll be stagnant for the rest of your life. And I don't think anybody here wants to stay in the same place. So
sometimes in life, you need to take a bold step. Na answer na obe take a bold step no. Fairly so adi hunu be esi we neso. Nejo shwehwehwe nnuemem epe baabi fa wo na asi. Answer na wotimi atake sa step na ansha. Wanye ne sa na sa wo kwan nnuema ebeji egu edi ama wo. Ade nyina mu no suade na bo ho mode na fa nyame etato na bibia ebeye kama edi ama bele no mu nsemi ni mede no eye na adwubikete ha ayetofia kwa TV me ma wo mo ne hwe.